今夜你会不会来？你的爱还在不在？
Today we're going to talk about how to ask questions in Chinese. Or to be more specific, I'll be talking about how to ask a particular type of question in Chinese, because in the languages of the world, there are two most fundamental question types. There is the WH question. You can kind of think of these as a type of open-ended question because the answer could be anything. It doesn't have to be limited to a small number of choices. For example, what is your name? Who is your teacher? When did you get here? Why did you come here? Okay, the answers could be anything. These are WH questions headed by a question word, and I won't be talking about these today. What I will be talking about is the yes-no question. That is, when you're limited to two choices, you answer yes when you agree with the statement and no when you disagree. These are also known as polarity questions in syntax because you're basically choosing between two opposing poles. Is it going to be yes or is it going to be no? So the question is, how do we ask a yes-no question in Chinese? Before we dive in though, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Now there are two things we need to make clear at the outset. One of these is that in Chinese, there are no such words as yes or no. Now when you come to think about it, yes is a general purpose word that means you agree with the statement, and no is a general purpose word that means you don't agree with the statement, whatever that statement might be. Okay, in Chinese, there are no such general purpose yeses or nos. So in Chinese, how do you agree or disagree with a statement? Well, if you want to agree with the statement, you would have to repeat the verb in the affirmative. If you disagree with the statement, then you repeat the verb in the negative. So to give an example, do you love cats? 你爱不爱猫? If I want to answer in the affirmative, I would repeat the verb love. I would say I. That means I do love cats. And if I don't, then I would say 不爱. I would say the verb in the negative. 不爱 means I don't love cats. So instead of saying a general yes or no, I repeat the verb in the affirmative or in the negative. To give another example, if somebody were to ask, are you a teacher? 你是不是老师? If I am, I would answer in the affirmative, 是, I am. And if I'm not, I would answer in the negative, 不是. So either way, I'm always going to repeat the verb, either in the affirmative or in the negative. That is how you answer a yes-no question in Chinese. The second thing we want to explain, and that is the main focus of this video, is that there is only one way to ask a yes-no question in Chinese, and that is to use the V not V mechanism. Now, what is the V not V mechanism? Let's go back to our original sentence. Do you love cats? If I do, I would answer in the affirmative using the verb I. Okay, the verb I means I do. And if I don't, I would use the verb in the negative. 不爱, don't love, means I don't. Okay, the verb in the affirmative I is the V. The verb in the negative, 不爱, is the not V. And if I put these two possible answers together, if I string them together to give 爱不爱, that is the V not V mechanism. So put together 爱 and 不爱, in which case you have 你爱不爱猫? Okay, that would be the question, do you love cats? Let's go to our second example. Are you a teacher? If I answer in the affirmative, I would say 是. If I answer in the negative, I would say 不是. Now string these two answers together and you get 是不是. 是不是 becomes the question mechanism. If I were to say 你是不是老师? Okay, that forms the question, are you a teacher? That is how we get from V and not V together to a question. Now on the surface, V not V seems really simple. You give both the affirmative and the negative answers and you string them together, and that is the question. But there are some complications. For example, what happens if the verb has more than one syllable? Take a verb like 喜欢. Okay, how do you ask something like, do you like America? Now you could just use the full verb 喜欢 and ask, 你喜欢不喜欢美国? But that sounds a little old-fashioned. These days, most people would say something like, 你喜不喜欢美国? Now, what's happening there is in the first instance of 喜欢, in the first V, the two-syllable verb 喜欢 is reduced to just one syllable. That is, it contains only the first syllable. In the first instance, instead of the full 喜欢, we use only 喜. So we would say 你喜不喜欢 rather than 你喜欢不喜欢. To give another example, willing, 愿意. If I were to ask, are you willing? The old-fashioned way would be 你愿意不愿意. But as we explained earlier, you can shorten the first 愿意 to just 愿. So you could say 你愿不愿意. So if you were at a wedding and you're being asked, are you willing to take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife? The are you willing part would come out as 你愿不愿意. When you have a verb that has two syllables, it is very common to omit the second syllable of that verb in the first instance in the V not V. 你喜不喜欢？你愿不愿意？
所以我最后问你一次，你愿不愿意嫁给我？
What about verb-object constructions, like to eat a meal, 吃饭, or to read a book, 看书? How do we ask a question with these? Well, you could use the entire construction. 你吃饭不吃饭？你看书不看书? But as you might have guessed, most people don't say that. Most people omit the object in the first instance and say something like 你吃不吃饭？你看不看书? Okay, so the object gets left until the end. With the V not V, all you're repeating is the V and not the object. Although there's a small caveat to that. Okay, when we say that we use the forms 你吃不吃饭？你看不看书？ leaving the object to the end, this is the form that is standard in standard Southern Mandarin. Now, in standard Northern Mandarin, there used to be a different form. If you look at textbooks like Tung and Pollard's 1982 Colloquial Chinese, you'll see examples of this Northern form. In that textbook, for example, the question, are you Pekingese, comes out as, instead of 你是不是北京人, they ask, 你是北京人不是? Okay, the 北京人 follows the first V rather than the second one. They give another sentence. Do they drink wine? Instead of 他们喝不喝酒? In that textbook, you have the northern form, 他们喝酒不喝? Now, why is there this northern-southern difference? The answer is in the fact that there used to be not just one standard Mandarin, but two. There is the southern standard Nanjing Mandarin, which was used by Chinese elite all over the country. And there was also the northern standard Peking Mandarin or Beijing Mandarin, which was used by the imperial court. These two forms were in competition. The British missionary Joseph Edkins wrote about this competition back in the 1850s. He wrote, the Nanjing Mandarin is more widely understood than that of Peking, but the Peking dialect must be studied by those who would speak the language of the imperial court. So you have that tension there. And in the case of the V not V question, it is the Southern Mandarin form that won out. The Northern form, where you put the object behind the first verb, is becoming increasingly obsolete. Now, I'm not saying that Southern Mandarin won out over Northern Mandarin in every aspect. What I'm saying here is only when it comes to the V not V question and the placement of the object. Right now, the way we're speaking Chinese now, the Southern form is much more common than the Northern form. So at this point in time, in the 2020s, more people say 你看不看书 than 你看书不看. More people say 你吃不吃饭 than people who say 你吃饭不吃. When we talk about the V not V question, the not in the mechanism, in most cases, is 不. So do you love something? 你爱不爱? Do you eat something? 你吃不吃? The not part is 不. But there are some exceptions. When the verb in question is 有, to have, then the negator changes. We don't use 不. We don't say 有不有. Instead, we use 没, 有没有 for do you have. So do you have money? 你有没有钱? Do you have a car? 你有没有车? When the verb is 有, we don't use 不, but 没. 有没有 is also a mechanism used when we want to ask about things that happened in the past. So for example, if I wanted to ask you, did you tell him? Did you tell him? I would say, 你有没有告诉他? Have you ever been to China? 你有没有去过中国? So use 有没有 in front of a statement if you're talking about something that happened in the past. Earlier, I mentioned that V not V is the only way to ask a yes-no question in Chinese. But you might be thinking, is it really? What about the question particle ma? Isn't that another way to ask a yes-no question? Well, we need to ask, what exactly is ma anyway? What ma is, really, is a reduced form of the negator 不 or 没有. Let me tell you where ma comes from. Okay, let's return to that northern form we talked about earlier. If I wanted to ask, have you ever been to China? Using the northern form, we might say something like, 你去过中国没有? 你去过中国没有? Now that 没有 at the end of the sentence gets reduced to ma. Okay, 没有 being reduced to ma. That is where the ma question particle comes from. Or to give another example, do you have money? In the northern form, we could say, 你有钱没有? Okay, again, if you reduce that 没有 to just ma, then you get the same sentence with the question particle ma. 你有钱吗? That is where the ma particle comes from. It is basically a phonological reduction of the negator. There is one other question mechanism, and that is the more formal mechanism, 是否. I can insert a 是否 into a statement to turn it into a question. So for example, do you like America? You like America is 你喜欢美国? Okay, we can insert 是否 in front of 喜欢, and that gives 你是否喜欢美国? That turns it into a question. It serves the same purpose as 你是不是喜欢美国? Now, what is this 是否 and where does it come from? Well, you might be able to guess from the form of the character 否. The 否 has a 不 on top and something that looks like a partial 是 on the bottom. Okay, 否 is basically a reduction of 不是. So 是否 is a reduction of 是不是. Looking at it from the perspective of phonology, you can say that in the transition from 是不是 to 是否, the b gets weakened to a fricative f. So you go from 不 to 否. And then the two syllables 不是 get reduced to just one. So 不是 becomes 否. So 是否 is basically a reduction of 是不是. Now, although 是否 comes from 是不是, there are some differences between the two. Okay, 是不是 can be followed by a noun. For example, I can ask, are you a teacher? 你是不是老师? When you use 是否, 是否 cannot be followed by a noun. You cannot say 你是否老师. Rather, due to its more abstract nature, 是否 can only be followed by a verb phrase. For example, 你是否喜欢他? Do you like him? Or is it the case that you like him? 他是否会说中文? Does he know how to speak Chinese? Or is it the case that he knows how to speak Chinese? Okay, so that is the mechanism 是否 and where it comes from.
是否这次我将真的离开你？是否这次我将不再哭？是否这次我将一去不回头，走上那条漫漫永无止境的路？是否这次
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.
泪水